Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ podcast. This is Andy, and I don't normally record any extra bits for the podcast that aren't in the radio show, but I thought I would drop in here just to say that this episode, when it was originally broadcast on the radio, it was promoting an event that was upcoming at the time. Of course, now, a week later, when it goes up as a podcast, the event is in the past, but you still will get a little taste of what it would have been like. And so, hope you tune in and enjoy it. Thanks for listening in to the podcast. It's great to have you wherever you are. If you are a new listener, I hope you do check out the archive of Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ.com, where there's over 100 episodes, all like this one, talking to people who are trying to make a positive impact on our world. And now, back to the original recorded radio show. Today on the show, we are going to be getting a little sneak preview of an event that is coming up this weekend. It is the People Against Poverty Summit. There's a number of different groups that are together in this, and there's a number of different elements they'll be speaking to. There'll be different workshops as well as chances to eat together and meet with people, and a strategy meeting where people can share what their groups are doing and how it can work together as a movement. And today on the show, we're going to hear from a couple of the people who will be speaking at some of the workshops. I spoke to Caspian from Anti-Poverty Network, who they are one of the groups involved in organising it. And then I spoke to a couple of people who will be on panels. Maiy Azize, about her talk, which is on the topic of the hidden harm of food banks and the NGO industrial complex, which is an interesting topic. And I also chatted to Mel Powersmith, who will be talking about housing and specifically whether increasing housing supply is the real solution to the housing crisis, or for Mel, it is about public housing. Increasing both the amount and the quality of public housing is what she sees as a better way of making sure everybody can have not just a roof over their head, although that is an important thing that we as a society are not currently managing to do, but also, houses that can be everything that a home means to us, a safe place and a place for us to express ourselves and build connections with the people around us as well, invite people into. So that is what's coming up on the show today. To start off with, let's hear a bit more about it from one of the organisers, Caspian from the Anti-Poverty Network.
Hi, I'm Caspian. I'm a member of the Anti-Poverty Network Queensland. That was a national network of grassroots anti-poverty organisations around the country, is co-hosting the People Against Poverty Summit this weekend.
Yes, and today on the show we are going to be talking all about the People Against Poverty Summit. And so I guess, do you want to give us a brief outline of what it is?
Yeah, so the People Against Poverty Summit is coming together of people who are part of grassroots anti-poverty movements around the country, alongside people who are interested in finding out more about the nature of poverty in society today, like the nature of anti-poverty organising that's currently happening and how to get involved or ally their movement with the anti-poverty movement. So we've got a bunch of excellent sessions from a bunch of different speakers on topics relating to poverty and community and building collective power, and a whole day of network building and planning.
It is an interesting word, poverty, because I suppose it's relative in terms of how much any person needs, how much poverty there is, but also I guess there's different kinds of poverty that we might talk about. So I guess broadly for the Anti-Poverty Network, I mean, what kind of thing is it that you're trying to stop?
Yeah, so for the Anti-Poverty Network and the anti-poverty movement generally, I think we really have a broad understanding of poverty. Like, poverty isn't just not having many dollars in your bank account. It's also a matter of not having time. It's not having agency and power in your community to shape your community in the way that you'd like to see it shaped, or connect with your community in the ways that you'd like to connect. It's not having the agency to control your time and spend your time as you want it, because the need to survive forces people into coercive labour or just into being time poor in a way that those who hold power and wealth in the world right now don't. And we recognise that poverty, like through that lens, is an issue that affects most of the people in the world, and is also at kind of like the core of like the dispossession and alienation that everyday people feel from the community and the world around them. Like, how many people see the state of the world right now and wish that it could be another way, or that they could have more time to look after their communities and their families and build up their communities and their families. But instead, that privilege of being able to control how you spend your time and how you contribute to and shape the world around you is really restricted to a select few with the power and the wealth to do so. And that's not a just society. So that's kind of how we understand poverty, and also the potential for our collective liberation in building a world without it. Because that would mean building a world where people can exist in their communities and support their communities and look after one another and build those relationships and look after each other and the world around them, rather than being beholden to the whims of the wealthy and how they direct their money and resources in order to shape the world.
And so the Anti-Poverty Network that's putting on this conference, in connection with the Anti-Poverty Network from South Australia as well, who some have come up, what kind of specific things do your organisations do?
Yeah, so we're organising with the Anti-Poverty Network of South Australia, as well as the Anti-Poverty Centre, the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, Nobody Deserves Poverty, and Community Union Defence League. And as anti-poverty organisations around the country, we do a bunch of different stuff. But I would say, like, if I was going to not talk your ear off about it, some of like the key work that we do, I'd say that it's a movement that's very focused on mutual aid, building networks of communities that can care for and support one another. It's network building and relationship building, like rebuilding the relationships that we've all been so isolated from in this modern day society. There's a lot of campaigning work as well around particularly welfare and other issues, as well as a lot of like media and narrative work. Because so often, like, the dominant narrative about what poverty is and what it means to be poor is shaped by people who aren't in poverty. And, like, I think one of our core principles is that idea of nothing about us without us. So the anti-poverty movement that we're working with is made up of people in poverty who have that direct lived experience and understanding of the issues and solutions to the challenges that we all face.
All right. Thanks, Caspian.
Thank you.
You are listening to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ. That is Caspian from Anti-Poverty Network about the People Against Poverty Summit that is happening this weekend, and there will be all kinds of different talks and gatherings, and one of the panels there is going to be on the intriguing topic of the hidden harm of food banks. And I think in the subtitle then it talked about the NGO industrial complex, and I thought one of the interesting things on there was one of the speakers listed was Maiy Azize, who happens to be high up working for a very large NGO, and so I thought, well, she maybe has some interesting perspectives on this topic, so I did get in contact with Maiy to hear some of what she'll be discussing over this coming weekend.
Maiy Azize, Deputy Director of Anglicare Australia.
So we're speaking to you today because you are part of the People Against Poverty Summit happening this weekend, and the workshop in particular that you're part of is called The Hidden Harm of Food Banks, which is an intriguing topic.
So the panel is myself and Fiona Moore, who's a member of the Anti-Poverty Centre and a committee member of the Anti-Poverty Centre. So she'll speak a bit about her experiences. I know that she finds food banks to actually be pretty expensive. My perspective is really more about the role that funding for food banks and other emergency relief is playing in kind of holding governments back from actually investing in raising the rate of income support, which is the thing that we know would make the biggest difference to poverty. So definitely when we go and advocate to government or we do a push in the media, the lines that come back are always that, we're putting all this money into food banks and other emergency relief. So that's one thing that is a problem. But the other thing I would say is that food banks aren't the only way to get food to people at a low cost. Anglicare agencies also do things like community pantries, where we buy food, people donate food, we sort it, and then we provide it to people for free. They can come and browse a community pantry and get something for free, or free hampers and things like that. So food banks are like a particular model.
Yeah, and I guess it should be said that possibly not all our listeners are familiar with what a food bank does. So maybe could you explain a little bit about what the food banks are?
Food banks, a market, I suppose, for people who are on low incomes and who are eligible to shop there. So basically you'd browse a store and buy items in a similar way that you would for a normal supermarket, but the idea is that the prices are a little bit lower.
And these are operated by like charities?
Yeah, so there's like a sort of food relief sector. So there's organisations like Food Bank, there's Second Bite, things like that. They operate food banks, and they are a different thing to community pantries. I think there's a bit of conflation in people's minds.
So let's delve a bit more into this, that you're in the sector of, dealing with poverty, and you're going in and advocating for, raised Centrelink payments and things like that. But instead there is this funding that's going to food banks. I mean, what's the reasoning for it from the government?
I think it's an easier thing for them to do. It's a more contained amount of money. If there's people in governments who have an ideological problem with just raising incomes, giving a bit of money to food banks and emergency relief is a way to kind of get around that. It's a way, but it's also just a way of doing something without having to kind of commit ongoing money. Emergency relief is a good thing. I mean, I work for Anglicare Australia. We provide emergency relief. We don't do food banks, but we do get funding for emergency relief to help people with things like bills and help people buy their own groceries. And of course, we do the community pantries and hampers and things like that. But the idea behind emergency relief is that it's supposed to be for emergencies. It's not supposed to be something that people use all the time because their incomes aren't high enough. There just isn't a substitute for raising people's incomes, and that has to be the focus of what we do.
I suppose there's probably some aspect of like paternalism, rightly or wrongly, that, to make sure that people, or that you give more money, it's not being spent on drugs or something like that, that it is being spent on food. Do you think that's an element of it? And I guess, do you think that is something worth considering, or is it misplaced?
I think there probably is an element to it. We know for people who don't want to raise incomes, when we go to them with arguments about how expensive it is for food and groceries and other things that people need to live, it is an easy talking point to come back and say, well, we can invest in these things that make food a bit cheaper. And as you say, there's that paternalism of not having to just give people the income to decide for themselves how they spend it. So I think that absolutely can be an element, and it's one of the risks here in this kind of work. Like I said, emergency relief can be really important for people who are having an emergency and having a tough time, but you don't want to play into narratives that actually end up harming people and make it harder to advocate for the things that we actually need.
Now, I'm interested in your own perspective on this topic, because in the notes, I think it does mention that phrase, the NGO industrial complex, which is sort of a critique of NGOs. But you work for a big NGO, and so I wonder how your view of what's the role of big NGOs in this situation, and are there times where there's part of the problem?
So I've had the real privilege of being involved with the Anti-Poverty Centre and learning from the activists in the Anti-Poverty Centre. I'm actually on the committee, and I was treasurer for a while. I have a personal view. This is not like an Anglicare perspective, that our role, if we work in this sector, is really to listen to people who have the direct experience and the direct expertise of actually trying to get by on these payments that are really low, trying to live in poverty in this country. I think it's a wrong perspective to think that we know better because we, might quote unquote work on the front line. There are people who live on the front line, and we should be doing everything we can to listen to them and support them. So I think that is the most important role that we can play. We've said, and this is, I guess, an Anglicare perspective, because our people have said this many times before, the powerful and transformative things that we've been able to do as a charity have been times when we've been part of social change. You can improve people's lives by doing the charitable work, but the key thing that you need to be doing is, I guess, challenging the unjust structures of society. That's actually part of the what we call the Anglican marks of mission. There are these 5 things that Anglicans are supposed to believe, and one of them is challenging the unjust structures of society. So that's a big part of what we do as.
I'm interested, obviously you have reached a higher position at Anglicare and you would have some experience. Are there times where you've found that, like, the kind of institutional inertia or something like that is something that has to be worked around to work in the best interests of those you're trying to serve?
It can definitely become really difficult to be led by and be influenced by people who are living the reality of living in poverty in Australia and navigating all those systems, and being an organisation that does things like apply for funding. I think it's one of the ways that you can end up getting caught in government agendas. It can create all sorts of problems. I will say that there are times where you just have to make difficult decisions. It was before my time, but back in the 2010s, the Anglicare network actually divested from government employment services. We just decided that it wasn't something that we could be involved with anymore, and that it wasn't ethical anymore. And now that's freed us up to do a lot of advocacy, but there are also a lot of other big NGOs that still do that work, that are still part of mutual obligations, payment suspensions, that kind of thing, and that makes it really hard for them to speak up against it. So there are times where you just have to make decisions, and those decisions mean that you're not funded to do something, or you're not part of a system.
So this weekend you will be at the People Against Poverty Summit, which is probably different from other parts of your job in that this is like a totally grassroots conference organised by activists rather than professionals in the sphere. What do you think is the importance of a conference like this?
Well, it's important to give people a space who are activists to do this kind of work, to learn from each other. I think it's primarily a space for them, but there's a part of me that's a little bit sad that people in our sector don't get more exposure to it because I mean, it's open to everybody, and you know, if there are people in Brisbane who work in kind of the mainstream sort of social sector, I'd really encourage them to register because sometimes we can think that we're doing the right things, but we're actually not listening, and we might be hurting people without realising it. So I think it can be beneficial for people like me, but I'm also just really excited to meet people, to learn from people, to hear new perspectives. The food bank stuff is really challenging, and I think it would be really challenging for some people to hear, especially Fiona's perspective. But I'm also going to be part of a session on housing, which is going to have a really strong focus on the need for more public housing. So these are really important conversations that just don't happen elsewhere. The edge can get, I guess, taken out of it when you're doing it as part of a mainstream organisation because people are afraid of, you know, how governments and boards and funders and things will receive it.
All right, well, thanks very much, mate, and I'll see you on the weekend.
Thanks, Andy.
You are listening to 4ZZZ. The Paradigm Shift is the show. Speaking with Maiy Azize from Anglicare, she said, but she will be speaking at the People Against Poverty Summit this weekend, which our show today is giving you a little preview of, and she'll also be speaking on a panel about housing, which is, of course, a big topic at the moment, and I spoke to one of the other people who will be on that panel from the Anti-Poverty Centre. This is Mel Powersmith, to talk about public housing and solutions for our housing crisis.
I'm Mel Powersmith and I am with the Anti-Poverty Centre as Treasurer and a policy advisor. So I've been working with them for the past, I think, over 2 years, and a lot of my contributions are around the topic for my thesis, which is housing. So if you want to narrow that down a bit, it's about our social housing system. And I come to that with sort of my own personal experience of living in social housing, as well as dealing with the welfare state and dealing with housing precarity.
Yeah, and so you will be doing a talk at the People Against Poverty Summit this weekend, and the title of your talk is Decommodification or Supply? What is the answer to the housing crisis? And so I suppose that there's a few elements to that. But do you want to start off with giving us a bit of an overview, I guess, of what this topic means to you and what kind of things you'll be hoping to bring out in that discussion?
Yeah, sure. So it's obviously very complex, and with the supply issue, I'm a bit limited with that, right? But the conversation is all about supply. Nobody's talking about distribution, and I think we have a distribution problem. I haven't sort of looked comprehensively at supply yet. I'm a sociologist. I'm not an economist, so I need a bit of help there. But some people are happy to just say that it's supply only. I think we've got a distribution problem.
When you say we have a distribution problem, I guess what do you mean by that?
Basically, what I'm going to talk about is basically the retrenchment of public housing. We had this sort of post-war welfare state going where a lot of countries, probably more so like the UK, had a huge public sector, right? Council housing. Australia never had a huge sector, but it played a bigger role than it does today. And historical investment was a lot stronger than it is now. So my presentation is about the consequences of that disinvestment, and it's about how people experience home and how they dwell in a residualised sector. So you'll hear a lot of commentary about all the problems in public housing, and they almost speak of it as if this is inherent to the tenure, but it's the way in which it's targeted and rationed out to the most marginalised people in society. So a personal experiences actually drove me to pursue this topic. So I lived in a community housing tenancy in Brisbane for 5 years, and I'd go to uni during the day and then I'd go back to my dwelling at night, and the things I saw there, it was like living in a parallel sort of world. And this is before I'd sort of, delved into all this welfare state theory. The things I saw there, I thought, somebody's got to look at this. I didn't know about what they call residualisation or anything like that at the time, but I was experiencing it. And I later learned about that, right? So if you have a look at international studies on social housing, if you have a larger sector that sort of covers a bigger tenant base, the community that you have living there is a bit more sort of, I don't want to pathologise, but it's got a bit more going on, right? Whereas in Brisbane, in Australia, and in Brisbane right now, we have this. So since 2019, they've stepped up this targeting, and they're only targeting households with complex needs. So in addition to financial need, you need to have another thing going on, like a disability or to be exiting institutional care, right? So imagine if you're targeting it exclusively to those households, and the problems are just sort of amplified there.
And so I guess, in theory, if there were more public housing with a more diverse range of tenants that were accessing it, you'd have better neighbourhoods of public housing, I guess, with better ability to kind of support some of those complex needs. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah, so you'd have, I guess, an organic sort of social mix. So, for example, when I lived there, I was pursuing my studies, and you'd have people who were sort of working as well as people who aren't in the labour force or people who aren't doing so well. I'll just give you an example of how this works, right? I was living, I guess, jowl and cheek with people who were in pretty severe circumstances, and it's almost like it exacerbates it, because if you've got, I guess, low sort of collective efficacy, the kind of things that can go down in a neighbourhood, you think about that. So I saw a lot of substance use, a lot of people with disabilities. It was also, the place was notorious to the police, so they weren't exactly helpful to help us with anything, right? They walked into our complex and they're like, oh, this place again. A lot of the tenants that I interview in my study express a desire for a broader base to live in public housing. So a more sort of dynamic community where you're not sort of just concentrating all of the difficulties that people experience in one area. And also you're not living in a sort of environment where your problems are getting exacerbated.
It's interesting, I guess, that as well, when the talk about housing supply, so often it plays into just the ability for developers to build big blocks of flats where they can extract as much profit as they can. But I guess they're part of what you're saying, beyond just a critique of that economic view, it's also about a qualitative view of what does it mean to live well in the buildings that we have? You know, what does it mean for people to have a house that can be a home? And I guess that's two sides of this kind of viewing it as a supply issue, that there's a quantitative and qualitative view of housing.
Exactly. There's always this, this sort of binary opposition between homelessness and housed, right? We're talking about some people who, they feel homeless at home. There's a lot of critical sort of literature. So, for example, I interviewed a person who had he'd been in an active war zone, and he walks out his door to find people unconscious on the ground, and that takes him back to that place. So I sort of see it as a form of neglect and almost violence towards the most marginalised people, right? I had to walk out of my unit and find people passed out on the ground. So yeah, it's really looking at that sort of qualitative, lived actual experience of these structural and economic issues.
So I guess in terms of other ways of doing it, a lot of the talk about solutions to the housing crisis has been that we need to, drop some red tape so they can build more housing or something like that. I guess what's alternative solutions to the housing crisis that you're looking at?
So I don't sort of say that public housing is the only solution, but there's not a lot of talk about it in the mainstream discourse. So a lot of people will say, we need more social housing. Now, social housing is an umbrella term for community and public housing, but what we're seeing is a shift away from public housing to community housing, and now there's another type of product, if you want to call it that, called affordable housing. So that's a product where you're paying, between 75 to 80% of the market rent, and it's subsidised, right? And the government's sort of devolving its responsibility to these these sort of non-for-profit organisations. And it all sounds good, but it's basically wiping its hands of doing anything. And look, I've heard this sort of, this counter argument. People say, we shouldn't rely on the state. Well, should we leave the state to neolibs and conservatives? I'm sorry to bore people, but I really think public housing is the solution. It's the purest form of decommodified housing, right? It's got the cheapest rents. And I want to reiterate, it's not state-owned housing. It's not some benevolent gift from the government. It's something that we have to fight for. They're going to build it because we demand it. It's a public good.
There are other models around the world where there's much higher proportion of public housing. I know I had a friend from Denmark, and when she was at uni, in student share houses, she and most of her friends were all living in government-owned flats, and that was sort of normal. Have you looked at other models from around the world?
Yeah, so we have this sort of comparative research, right? So we look at welfare states in comparison across the world. And yeah, there's a lot of societies that do sort of invest more in that sort of state and municipal housing. So Denmark definitely, and it's sort of structured a little bit differently, but there are points of comparison.
All right, and just on a slightly different topic, you mentioned at the start that you are part of the Anti-Poverty Centre. Can you tell us a bit about what the centre does?
Sure. So it was sort of founded by people who are on so welfare and people who have a direct experience of marginalisation and poverty, because there's sort of a professional lobby and academic groups and sort of NGOs that sort of purport to speak for us, and we'd like to actually advocate directly for ourselves. So Anti-Poverty Centre sort of it facilitates the participation of people who are left out of the conversation. And I sort of met Kristen and Jay at a conference, actually, and I was like, wow, at the time, because Kristen and Jay were actually openly talking about being on Centrelink, and that was something I'd never seen. And I was sitting there, because I work, but I'm on a means-tested payment, and the shame of it, like, I'd never seen people speak openly about it. And I thought that they've emboldened me to sort of be open about that. And they're changing the conversation. And I thought, I want to get amongst it. I want to be involved.
All right. Thanks very much, Mel, for having a chat with us today. That is Mel Powersmith there. She will be part of the People Against Poverty Summit this weekend. That organisation she was just talking about, the Anti-Poverty Centre, is one of the different groups who are involved in organising it. So well worth checking out, and great local event that people are putting on. Ordinary people trying to get together and plot how we can make a better world, which is so important and something that on the paradigm shift here I love to get behind. Love interviewing people doing their best in their ordinary lives to make a change and to change our communities and change our economic system. Who knows? It's done by little degrees, little things where you can find alternatives and find a bit of power and a bit of leverage in the system to where we can exert some change. If you are interested in more radical events, I'll just plug that the Brisbane Radical Events Diary is a place where you can find them all. It is breadbne.substack.com, or if you just search for Brisbane Radical Events Diary, you should find it. And on there, you'll find lists of all the different events going on, which every week there's heaps of different events, people getting together to do their best to change this place where we live in, change it for the better. And 4ZZZ, of course, has been doing that for a long time as well. We're celebrating 50 years this year, and so good on you for tuning in and being part of non-profit community radio, and we'll keep going, hopefully, with your support. That is all we have time for on The Paradigm Shift. I'll see you next week.